Hello guys, welcome back to our journey into Mpesa series. In this episode, we are going to have a look at how we are going to do a Lipa na Mpesa query request. So let us get started. Let's have a look at how our request and responses are going to be. So this is going to be our request. All right. Format a little bit for clarity, and then this is going to be our response. All right, one moment. Now this is actually going to be the external request. This is going to be the internal request. I'll explain in a moment why I'm using that. So the response is one that is going to look something like this. Let us format it a little bit, right? So number one thing that we're going to have a look at is why I'm calling this an internal request and this an external request. So the only thing that we can expose maybe to our customers is maybe just by telling them to give us a checkout request ID. In this case, we already have maybe our business shortcode. We can generate a password and also a timestamp. This is especially for our internal consumption. So that being said, we do not have to expose the whole of this data in our request, such that each and every time a consumer sends a request, he or she, they have to send all this data. I think that would be too much information requesting from the user, and we can be able to automatically generate this behind the scenes. So let's proceed and create our DTOs. So I've already done all this implementation, so I'll just be taking you through how you can be able to achieve the same on your end. So number one, grab this particular structure. Then in your DTOs, as usual, just proceed and create a new DTO representation. All right, you can name it anything you want here. In my case, I named it external LNM request, which basically is this. So basically this structure, this class or the DTO is going to represent a structure like this, the external LNM query request. I hope that is clear. So secondly, proceed and create your internal request. All right, as usual, go again to your DTO, then generate your POJ. All right, name it anything you want, then click OK. The other thing, in my case, by the way, I named it internal LNM request. So this is the class that's going to represent our internal LNM request. All right. Lastly, we also need to have a DTO representation of our response. All right. So in my case, I generated it and called it LNM query response, which is this one. Okay, now that we have the basic structure of how our requests and responses are going to look like, we can now continue with our implementation. So number one thing that I did, I came here, so I created this new method. Basically this is, I called it an LNM query response. This is what we expect to receive from Safaricom, and we're going to be passing in an internal LNM request. Now if you go to its implementation, you're going to see that we are basically mapping the internal request data to our external request DTO. So as you can see, the business shortcode, it is basically the Lipa na Mpesa STK push code, which in our case, as you remember from our previous episode, we configured it in application YAML, which is this one. All right. Then we proceed and generate a timestamp and an STK push password. As you can see, all this is similar to what we did previously to when we are doing an STK push transaction, right? It's more or less the same. So after we've done that, we're just basically now setting the various attributes as is required of us. So we are setting a password, the timestamp, and the request ID, which in our case we are fetching it from the internal LNM request. Here, as usual, we are generating an access token. Then we are just proceeding here to convert the external LNM request into a JSON representation of that particular POJO. From there, we proceed and now invoke the request to the Mpesa query, which is going to give us the response. And as you can see, when you come here to application YAML, I added another configuration value, which basically takes in the LNM query request URL, which is this one. So I named it LNM query request URL. After I added it here, then you'll also be required to come to your Mpesa configuration, which is under config, then add it as required, LNM query request URL. All right, that being said, now here is just basically where now we are doing the HTTP request, and we are basically converting the value or the response we are getting from Safaricom into an LNM query response. All right, so that being said, we can now run our application and see if it is going to run as expected. So I'm going to rerun that. Okay, it's running on port 8080. So first things first, I'm going to clear all this so that we can start afresh. So I'm going to initiate an STK push transaction so that it's going to give us a checkout request ID, and it is this checkout request ID that we can use to check our transaction status. All right, so let us get started. I'm going to initiate. Okay, yeah, the STK push has come on my phone, so I'll just going to complete this transaction, and then when you come here, there you go, it was a successful transaction. Okay, so now if you come and get this checkout request ID, by the way, which you see is going to be similar to what they said here. All right, so we can come to our endpoint /mobile money /query LNM request. I'm going to key in that request ID, and then I'm going to initiate, and you can see the result code is 0 with the result description of success. So any result code other than 0, that means that transaction did not complete, or basically it was not a successful transaction. One thing that I haven't mentioned is how we now created this query LNM request. Let us come back to our application. When you come to the controller, in this case the Mpesa controller, I added this endpoint query LNM request, which is what we are now calling in our postman. All right, so this query LNM request is going to take an internal LNM request from the body, and then we're basically calling Daraja API dot get transaction status. Then we are passing in the internal LNM request. So basically this is now the JSON representation of our internal LNM request. I hope that makes sense, but in case there are any concerns, if there is any place where you'd like clarification, be sure to shoot in the comment section, and I will of course respond as required. All right, so I think this was a pretty much easy one, and without further much ado, this brings us to at least the end to this particular episode. So be sure to subscribe and turn on the notifications. I will see you on the next one. Goodbye.